Welcome to God is Open. I am your host, Christopher Fisher. Today on God is Open, we're going to be responding to this Mike Winger guy. Look at this guy. He's very charismatic. He's got the kind of the plaid t-shirt going on, the plaid button up, and nicely done hair. He's got a full head of hair and glasses. A very charismatic guy. It's hard not to like him. It's hard not to. I can see why his church is really popular, why his videos get a lot of hits and views. 8,000 views on a theology video, so that's pretty good. People like this guy because he's charismatic. And being charismatic is not a bad thing, but a lot of times your charisma overrides your points. People believe you because you deliver your points with charisma rather than the merits of the points themselves. So let's hear what Mike Winger has to say about open theism.
We're going to talk about foreknowledge tonight, God's foreknowledge. The question we're going to ask is, what does God actually know? What does God know? And you might think, well, that's easy. He knows everything. But I think there's more to it than that. And I think it's exciting to get to the more to it parts. And then we're going to answer some questions that skeptics sometimes ask, like, if God knows what I'm going to do, then how is it possible that I actually have free will?
I like his mannerisms. He's a soft talker. He's talking to people like he's in just like a normal conversation. So I can see why this appeals to people. People like listening to this. It's like a friendly conversation.
If God knows you're about to drink the coffee you're holding, do you really have a choice to not drink it? That's a good question. We're going to answer that. We're going to deal with something called open theism, which is something you've probably likely never heard of. A lot of people haven't heard of, but it's the idea that God doesn't actually know the future, but God only guesses at the future.
So where did you get that definition from? Is that like an open theist book you opened up and it says, open theism is the view that God guesses at the future? I don't think so. I think you're poisoning the well here. And so even me knowing the future, I know I'm going to go to work on Monday, and this is not because, I'm just guessing at the future. I'm guessing I'll go to work tomorrow.
Blinken, what are you doing up there?
Guessing? I guess no one's coming?
This is me knowing because it's improbable that that's not going to happen. I know where I'm going to be. I know what I'm going to be doing. I know I have the power to bring it about. It's not a guess at the future. It's a knowledge of the future that's concrete. There might be some guesses about the future, but I don't spend my time guessing about the future. I don't know. Like even in the betting markets, they're not guesses. It's like I put my money on Trump still being president in January of 2019. It's not a guess. It's not a guess. And I'll make money off of that little bet thing. Now, 10%, that's a pretty good markup. But anyways, so I like his definition. It's a little bit of poisoning the well. Yeah, just a little bit of poison. Not a ton of poison. He didn't shake the bottle in there. He just added a little bit of poisoning the well.
You know, he's like kind of working all things together for good, but he's sort of like juggling everything that's going on to try to bring out some good reaction. Now, this is actually a growing, more and more popular view in the world out there, this open theism view. We're going to deal with that. And
we can only hope.
We're going to continue going through Romans verse by verse as we keep moving forward, but because we hit the topic of foreknowledge, predestination, and I thought, let's just pause and let's unpack these ideas, and then we'll keep going through Romans 8 into Romans 9 as we get to the end of those. So, first thing I want to do is we'll read the passage we're in. So we're here in Romans chapter 8. And starting in verse 28, it says, "And we know that God works all things together for good to those who love God, to those who are the called according to his purpose, for whom he foreknew, he also predestined to be conformed to the image."
So didn't he just kind of criticize open theism for God just being like a master manipulator? I got this book in front of me. It's called Double Take. And in it has a passage that was quoted by Gregory Boyd on this Romans 8 verse about this synergy, this working together. And the working together is God working with creation to work all things together. And isn't that what he just criticized with open theism, that God juggles things together? And I'm just going to read a real quick passage from this. The Greek word synergio, from which the English word synergy comes, does not mean work out or fall into place. In the New Testament, it always signifies the active involvement of real actors accomplishing some task. To treat Panta as a subject implies that everything that happens is actively and consciously working at the project of making good things happen to people who love God. That kind of claim would be linguistically odd, to say the least. Theologically, the scriptures never attribute goodwill and active working to all things. If good things are being made to happen, it is because God is at work transforming all things into something they would not become on their own. So this verse is about God's active involvement with believers in context of this verse. And it's important to know that that's an open theistic concept that he seems to have criticized a little bit.
Of his Son, that he might be the firstborn among many brethren. Moreover, whom he predestined, these he also called. Whom he called, these he also justified. And whom he justified, these he also glorified. And so that's what's bringing us the topic of God's foreknowledge. It's really a theological topic. And there's an issue here between Calvinism and Arminianism, or I should say maybe Calvinism and everybody else. And so the non-Calvinists. I wouldn't consider myself an Arminianist, but I wouldn't consider myself a Calvinist, although a lot of the people who watch on YouTube probably think I am a Calvinist, because we have a lot in common with Calvinists, actually, in our view of God's glory and sovereignty.
So I really like Matt Chandler, remember the Matt Chandler podcast, his handling of the foreknowledge, because he understands that this foreknowledge is about intimate knowledge, like a relational knowledge, rather than like a head knowledge, like, oh, I know something before it happens. That's not what the word's about. And which is really funny, because who does God foreknow? The elect, right? The chosen people. And Calvinists and even some Arminians will want it about like God just knowing the names of certain individuals before things happen. But doesn't God foreknow everything then? Doesn't God foreknow both the elect and the non-elect? It's talking about people who he foreknows. So what's going on there? How does that work out in your theology? It's funny. It's funny.
Our firm, unembarrassed willingness to stand on the scriptures and just proclaim what it says, that is in common with Calvinists. I like a lot about Calvinists, but I don't always agree with everything that's said.
Yeah, for the word for foreknowledge, that is a relational word. So God has intimate knowledge of these people. God has intimate knowledge of the remnant. God has intimate knowledge of the people who are seeking to serve him, and those are the ones who he predestined to be conformed into his image. That's what's going on there. When does the foreknowledge, the intimate knowledge, take place? When Paul uses the word, he's talking about people who knew Paul in Paul's youth. So the foreknowledge isn't like a timeless, eternal foreknowledge or anything like that. It's this knowledge that you get from experience in relation with people.
Said there. So we're going to get into that, but before we do, let me just say this. Here's my little caveat, my little disclaimer. The debate between Calvinism and Arminianism is a discussion between believers, not non-believers. And sometimes people will attack with these sort of, I don't know, I'll be honest, irritating ideas that come out. Like, well, if Calvinism is true, then God is evil, because he's making all these things happen. And I'm thinking, so what if Calvinism is true and then you stand before God? You're going to be like, God, you're evil. You going to try that? Does that sound smart to you? If you're wrong, you're blaspheming God when you say.
What kind of argument is this? Is this like a utility argument? So if God is evil, let's just hypothetically pretend we live in a world where God is like truly evil and he's just like really bad and evil, and the most evil thing in your mind, think about it, and then just attribute it to God. And then let's pretend that's reality, and you stand in front of him on Judgment Day. Are you supposed to say, oh, you're not evil, because it serves a utilitarian function to make you not become counter to him, in opposition to him? Is that your argument, Mike Weger? That doesn't seem like a very good argument.
Say that. That seems like a pretty weird thing to say. But then on the flip side, you'll have a Calvinist, and I actually talked to a Calvinist a couple days ago. Good, friendly conversation. But he said, if Calvinism is not true, if non-Calvinists are right, then what you have is a weak God, because he wants people to be saved, but he just can't make it happen. And I just said, you're going to stand before God and tell him he's weak? Like, is that what you're going to do? And what this is what I like to call trotting out the ark.
It's argument from inverse consequences. It's a logical fallacy.
Do you remember the story in the Old Testament when the children of Israel were fighting their enemies, the Philistines, and they thought, man, we're not winning against our enemies. Tell you what, let's get the ark out of the temple or out of the tabernacle. Let's bring it out onto the battlefield and let's go to war with the ark. In other words, we're going to make it so it's like, God, you have to give us victory, because if we lose the ark. Well, they lost. And what some people do is they trot out the gospel. And they feel their theological position so important on this, whatever topic it is, say it's foreknowledge, Calvinism, whatever, that they're going to say that anyone who disagrees with them on the particulars of their theology is actually disagreeing on the gospel itself. But that's why I start off by saying we're brothers.
Yeah, people are so funny. Often I see the trend that the things that people just really, really, really care about, those are the things that also just so happen to be the issues critical for salvation. Like I was talking to these moral government people this once, and it's like, okay, so take someone who believes in salvation by faith alone, and believes that you can't lose your salvation, and they believe that. And then they're also like a really good person, and they live a life just like you. And they said, no, that guy's not saved. That guy's like hellbound. He's like, because he believes in a different method of salvation, even though all his actions and his belief in Jesus' death and resurrection are the same. It's so funny. It's like, not only do you have to believe in the right things, but you have to believe that believing in the right things is the method of salvation, also doing the right thing. And then they break down in this thing like, no one can believe in once saved, always saved, and then also be a good person. It's like, okay, sure, whatever makes you happy.
Brothers and sisters having a conversation here. It's not a question of gospel issues. Now, when it comes to me and a Jehovah's Witness, that's a gospel issue. The ark is involved here, so to speak. Me and Mormonism, that's a gospel issue. Even me and Catholicism, that's a gospel issue. If you don't think so, you have never read Catholic theology.
Well, yeah, here's I'm going to break this to you. Not all Catholics, not very many Catholics read or understand their own theology. So a lot of Catholics actually turn out to be real good Christians. I don't think like the bishops or whatever, that people high, and it's just like Calvinism. A lot of Calvinists are good Christians, but I don't think the people that are high in the totem poles are Christians, because they know what their theology actually says, and they believe what their theology actually says. So yeah, the same argument could be made for Catholics and Calvinists or whatever, but the laymen, I don't think the laymen are not Christians. They just don't understand their own theology.
It's a gospel issue, but Calvinism, Arminianism, that is not a gospel issue. Thank you, Lord. So let's just keep that in mind. And what we want to do is we want to be able to look at the text, and rather than starting with maybe a construct of theology, just say, what can I affirm about God's foreknowledge? What can I affirm about, say, predestination? We'll get there next week. And then just believe those things. That's the simplicity that I'm going to come from. I want to know, what can I affirm here? And then we will do Q&A at the end. So you might want to write those questions down, because you might forget them as we're going. So first off, what does God know? What does God know? Well, we have a Christian theological position, which is fairly unanimous in Christianity, which is the idea that God is omniscient. He has all knowledge, omni meaning all, and science meaning knowledge. He's omniscient. He has omniscience. All knowledge. You could say God knows everything. And that would be fair. But we're going to consider some different aspects of God's knowledge. Different sides of the equation of what God knows based on Scripture. So we're going to establish omniscience, doing something we like to call systematic theology. Systematic theology, or what you might just think of as a topical Bible study.
So there's problems with topical Bible studies. A lot of times people just quote verses. They assume meaning into those verses. They don't look at context. And so just watch for it. If someone's trying to just prove something by just a list of verses, do they dive into any of those verses to discuss the context? Who's talking? What are they talking about? What is the point in context? The words have meaning. They're trying to convince someone of something, trying to get some idea to someone. What's going on in context, and why is that a good verse to establish whatever absolute? Remember, there's in language, people often use generalizations or hyperbolic talk. hyperbolic speech. They talk in very concrete terms when there are rules of thumb exceptions. Paul talking in Romans says that all have sinned. Does he include Jesus, or is this hyperbolic? Is he just using a hyperbolic generalization? And the passage he's quoting King David talking about all have sinned. And in that passage, there's righteous people. He says there's none righteous, no, not one. But then he talks about the righteous generation. And of course, he's counting himself as the righteous. So in that context, it's hyperbolic. It's a generalization. So is he going to go into the context and prove from the context that his ideas of omniscience are proved from these proof texts? Or is he just going to quote them and just pretend they mean what he wants them to mean? Is he just going to assume his position onto the text?
That's the fancy term for topical Bible study. We pick a topic and we survey different passages of Scripture and then pull together all these truths to get a full understanding. So, God knows everything first. I'm going to give you, I think it's about 5 things that God knows. The first one is God knows everything that happens in the universe. He knows everything that's actually happening right now. And I'll give you several verses for this. Job 28:24. Job 28:24, it says, "For he looks to the ends of the earth and sees under the whole heavens."
So this is actually talking about the ancient idea that God is in heaven and he peers down, uses visual confirmation to see everything on earth, and acquires active omniscience. He's acquiring information that he looks to see. And this is not the idea of omniscience that classical theology believes in. They believe in this inherent knowledge that's ungenerated and it doesn't come from outside, and God doesn't look to know. But Job is describing this, and this is Job in context. And does everything Job says, is it even trustworthy? A lot of it is. Job is commended for speaking right about God, but you also have to use critical thinking to figure out what's correct and what's not correct, because God also says that Job is speaking without wisdom or without coming from a place of knowledge. And so you got to be very careful when quoting Job. Whenever you're quoting Job, who is talking? And you better not be quoting Job's friends, because that's definitely not acceptable as true theology.
God's aware of all that is going on everywhere in the earth, underneath the whole heavens. He sees it all. Job 31:4, it says, "Does he not see my ways and count all my steps?" All my steps. The implication, he's not just vaguely aware, but he's more intimately aware of.
Right, and that again is God is looking to see. This is Job's idea of how God knows. God acquires information from sight. This is not what you want. This is not, Mike Winger, your idea of omniscience. And it's just going over your head that the Bible always describes how God knows what he knows. And if you skip over that, you're missing quite a lot. You're assuming some other different standard of omniscience under the Bible that the Bible doesn't present.
The details of what's going on in my life. Job 34, verses 21 and 22. Job 34, verses 21 and 22, it says, "For his eyes are on the ways of man." And
He did it. He quoted Job's friends. Job's friends are condemned by God, and then God wants to kill him. Okay? So that's really funny. And Job's friends are wrong about God. That doesn't mean everything that Job's friends say are wrong, but when people are quoting Job's friends for theology, that's funny to me. It's like quoting people who God condemns as being wrong and saying, this guy's theology is mine.
And he sees all his steps. There is no darkness nor shadow of death where the workers of iniquity may hide themselves.
This is God looking to see, and people might try to hide from God, but God knows where they're at. And you find similar concepts like this throughout the Bible, where in Ezekiel, there's people who try to hide from God because their idea is that God is looking from heaven, and it's a visual omniscience. And so sometimes, like in Job, it talks about how the clouds might block his vision, and but he could see through the clouds is the correct theology, that God's vision is not going to be blocked by the clouds. In Ezekiel, God's vision is not going to be blocked by being under the earth or in a basement, in a dark room. God can know what's happening in these dark places without direct line of sight. And direct line of sight is a common ancient conception of how omniscience works, knowing all things. So that's what it's countering here. And we can accept that theology, but again, that's not your omniscience. That's not what you want in how God knows what he knows. But remember, Ellie who's talking here. Ellie who's one of the friends. The friends are condemned. Take it with a grain of salt. Take it. He doesn't know what he's talking about.
There's no way of escaping God's awareness. Now this type of knowledge could be somehow connected. This is just a could be. I'm not making my theology on this. Could be somehow connected to God's omnipresence. I mean, because if he's omnipresent, he's certainly aware of everything that's going on everywhere.
That's very astute. And so classical conceptions of God's omnipresence, and people get mad at me for saying omnipotence, omnipresence, omnipotence. So similar word constructs. So I'll still use omnipotence. It works. But similarly, this omnipresence in classical theology is that God is outside of space and time, not that God is in every square inch of everywhere. And that's something that's important to note, because in the classical tradition, you need to make God other. You need to take him out of the world. He can't have all presence in the sense that he inhabits every square inch of everywhere. But a lot of times in ancient religions, like Zeus was a god of the air. And Zeus had omnipresence in the sense that since he was affiliated with the air and the air was everywhere, that's how he acquires all that information. And so it's kind of astute of him to say that omnipresence might be associated with omniscience. Although that's not the case that's being made here in these verses that he's quoting. It's about a direct line of sight.
Proverbs 15:3, here's another verse for you. It says, "The eyes of the Lord are in every place, keeping watch on the evil and the good." So if you like that he's keeping watch on you.
Yeah, so eyes of the Lord is an interesting phrase that appears throughout the Bible. Let's type it in, eyes of the Lord. And sometimes it's used for maybe God's visual perception of things, but sometimes it's used for angels. All right, so let's look at Zechariah and see what it says about the eyes of the Lord here. I'm not saying this is every single use of eyes of the Lord is this, but this is what it says. "For whoever has despised the day of the small things shall rejoice, and shall see the plumb line in the hand of Zerubbabel. These 7 are the eyes of the Lord, which range through the whole earth." And so you got 7 eyes, and they range throughout the whole earth. And what they are is they're angels, and they're angels of judgment. And you see these angels reoccur in Revelation, in which the 7 angels of the Lord are the 7 stars, the 7 eyes. They act as God's messengers to earth, or God's enforcers. So the eyes of the Lord in the Proverbs are on the wicked. Is it God's angels that are watching, God's enforcers, God's judgment? Is it like the eyes of the king are on this place? Like a king might have a network of spies throughout anywhere. And like in Narnia, Chronicles of Narnia, they say the eyes of the witch are throughout these woods. She's got eyes and ears everywhere. And what that is it's a statement about general surveillance, about using a network of spies. So what is going on in this verse? Have you considered these alternative possibilities? And note the visual nature of this verse. God has eyes, and the eyes are watching. God is acquiring information from outside himself. This is, again, not the omniscience that you care about, that you want to attribute to God. And so he's doing this Mote and Bailey thing, or maybe he just doesn't understand classical understandings of omniscience, how omniscience works and functions. And so he's using a very superficial treatment of it. And he's not proving the classical notions that he wants to engage in. God's omniscience is a visual omniscience that he acquires from outside himself by watching the world. And all his proof texts so far have spoken to that. Again, this is not his theology.
That's good. That's a good sign in your life. If you're like, oh man, he sees me everywhere, then that means maybe you should get your heart right with the Lord. Matthew 10, 29 and 30. Matthew 10, 29 and 30. It says, "Are not 2 sparrows sold for a copper coin?" Do you recognize the words of Jesus here? "And not one of them falls to the ground apart from your Father's will, but the very hairs of your head are all numbered." God's intimate, detailed knowledge of you, the number of hairs on your head. So I would say it's
a present counting of current events.
It's fair to say, there's other verses we could go to, but it's fair.
And again, nothing he's shown shows that these are like mechanical, and these function mechanically, like metaphysical absolutes, rather than volitional omniscience, or omniscience that is being described in hyperbolic terms to communicate a point. Just like Paul says, all has sinned, not all has sinned. Jesus didn't sin, right? That's the normal Christian position.
Fair to say, God knows, number one, everything that happens in the universe. If a star goes supernova, God's aware of it before us, partially because of it takes time for light to travel across the universe to get to us. But he's aware of it as it happens. He knows all that is happening. Okay, so number two, second thing God knows. God knows our secret thoughts. Our secret thoughts, or you could just say our thoughts, because they're all kind of secret, right? 1 Chronicles 28:9, it says, "As for you, my son Solomon, know the God of your father and serve him with a loyal heart and with a willing mind, for the Lord searches all hearts and understands all the intents of the thoughts." He knows my heart and what's going on in my thought process, and he's even searching my motives, the intent, why I was thinking that, or what my desire was there.
So yeah, let's look at how language is used in the Bible, and let's read about the Prince of Tyre, or Prince of Tyre. That's the more scholarly pronunciation of Tyre. "The Son of man, say to the Prince of Tyre, thus says the Lord God, because your heart is proud, and you have said, I am God, I sit in the seat of the gods, in the heart of the seas, yet you are but a man, and no God, though you make your heart like the heart of God. You are indeed wiser than Daniel, no secret is hidden from you. By your wisdom and your understanding, you have made wealth for yourself, gathered gold and silver into your treasuries." So look at that language. No secret is hidden from you. So the Prince of Tyre, he knows all the secrets of the heart too, right? Or is this being hyperbolic? So what kind of language is used, and does your proof text actually mean what you claim it means? That's why going into context is very important. Who is being spoken to, in what context, what are they supposed to draw out of this? Is this supposed to be a metaphysical absolute, or is it a gross generalization? Not like a yucky generalization, just like a broad generalization, gross generalization of language. And does God always know everyone's heart at all instances? What is testing? What's the function of testing that we see in Genesis with Isaac and Abraham, and he lifts the knife, and God is doing a legitimate test to see what Abraham will do in certain circumstances. God tests the heart. So maybe that's the mechanical way that God knows hearts. God tests hearts to see what the hearts will do. And is he showing that this omniscience, this knowledge, is eternally ungenerated knowledge that's inherent in God from all eternity? Or is this another piece of knowledge that God knows through means? God knows it organically through the means available to acquire this knowledge. It's critical. It's critical. So when you're dealing with people who maybe they're surface level thinkers about these issues, they don't understand what's actually believed about their position. They'll use proof texting in this very haphazard manner, where they just throw out verses. They don't read the verses at face value, and then they pretend those verses mean their theology. I don't think this guy believes that God acquires through sight, that God acquires knowledge through testing. I don't think he believes that, but he's using proof texts that say explicitly that.
So Psalm 44, verse 21b, "For he knows the secrets of the heart." God knows the secrets of your heart.
How though? How? What's the mechanism? And in context, who's speaking to who? What are they trying to say? And what's the information that we're supposed to get out of it?
This is a great scripture for you to put up on your wall. Jeremiah 17:9. It's about your heart. We like singing about our hearts, thinking about our hearts, writing love songs about your heart, and saying things like, "God knows my heart." It's Jeremiah 17, verses 9 and 10 is for you, if that's you. "The heart is deceitful above all things and desperately wicked. Who can know it?" So you don't know your heart. That's the point. Your own heart tricks.
That's the point. You don't know your heart. You don't know your heart. Okay.
You. You ever felt led of the Lord to do something that wasn't of the Lord? Well, you were being led of your heart, and your heart was deceiving you, trying to find a motive, trying to find a...
So in Psalms 139, which I'm sure he's going to quote at some point, where King David is talking to God, he says, "There's nothing evil in my heart, and just test my heart, and you'll see, God." And he says in a different psalm, King David says, "My heart has been on you since the womb. I've lived my life for you. I've served you in righteousness." And so a lot of these hyperbolic claims, you need to show. He wants to take hyperbolic claims as generalizations, and or he wants to take hyperbolic claims as metaphysical absolutes. Okay, sure, that might be a valid reading, is metaphysical absolute, but that's not the only reading, and it's probably, in my eyes, not the most natural reading of those verses. Rather those verses seem like hyperbolic statements to make points to the immediate audience, to drive home talking points, right? That's what's going on there, rather than speaking metaphysics. He thinks when he's reading the Bible, he thinks when he's reading the Psalms, he's reading an instruction manual for rebuilding a car, where it says, insert this piece to this piece, and then he takes them all as metaphysical absolute. But then what he does is he doesn't even read the verses. He doesn't read the verses, like the verses we already talked about, where God acquires information through seeing. He's just like, he just glosses over that. He just pretends that verse means his specific understanding of omniscience, which is eternal, ungenerated knowledge. So it's funny. It's funny.
A good excuse to do the thing you felt like doing.
Now, I don't think this guy's being purposeful in any of these misrepresentations of the verses and this very bad experiment in not being able to read contextually the meaning of verses. I don't think he's being purposeful. I think he's generally has not given this any in-depth thought. He generally is just ignorant of the issues at stake, and he's just so inoculated, or he's in such a bubble world that he's never been presented with different views of these verses. And so if he's never been exposed to alternative views, his mindset is probably not there to pick them up.
This, of course, is the cause of adultery. And people saying, the Lord's leading me to get divorced. And that sort of content a lot of times is coming from this. So the heart's deceitful above all things, desperately wicked. This is consequently quoted wrong a lot of times within Calvary chapels. I don't know how that started, but it did. We like to say the heart is deceitfully wicked. Think about that for a second. If it's deceitfully wicked, that means it's pretending to be wicked, but it's actually good. I was being wicked, tricked you, I was good. That's not, it's deceitful above all
language allows the alternative understanding of that phrase too, my friend.
Things, and desperately wicked. Of course, it's the most deceitful because it deceives you from the inside out. I mean, I deceive myself with my own heart. I need the Lord. But then it talks about God's knowledge of your heart. I, the Lord, search the heart. I test the mind, even to give every man according to his.
Yeah, that's how God acquires the knowledge. That's how God acquires. It's not gonna. He's not gonna pick up on this. He's not. He's just gonna keep rolling forward with his ideas of omniscience.
Ways according to the fruit of his doings. So not only does God have knowledge of your heart, he has more knowledge than you do of your own heart. God knows my heart is actually not saying I know I'm good and God does too. It's more like saying God knows my heart.
How does God know your heart?
And I hope I'm doing all right, because my heart's deceitfully wicked. Not. It's deceitful and desperately wicked. Hebrews 4:13. Maybe this sort of knowledge of God knowing our hearts, this will make more sense now. Hebrews 4:13. And there is no creature hidden from his sight, but all things are naked and open to the eyes of him to whom we must give account.
Oh God, what a verse about God seeing to know. Oh, it's visual omniscience that he acquires through sight. Oh, say it's not so. It's another verse. God acquires knowledge through sight. Every single one of his verses. This is actually the ancient conception of how God operates, that God gets omniscience through visual sights. And, there's alternate passages like in Isaiah about God knowing the future, but that knowledge is not like the sight knowledge. That's God knowing things that he will do in the future. And God testing a heart is like a predictable knowledge, that God tests your heart to know your heart, and then he can predict what your heart will do based on his testing of your heart. But the knowledge, the general information knowledge, like God knows my car is gray or something like that. That's like a visual omniscience in the eyes of the ancient writers. Even in the author of Hebrews, which Hebrews is perhaps the most philosophical philosophically orientated text. It's written at a very late date, and you might find elements of Platonizing in the Hebrews, and this is their idea of omniscience. This is their idea of how God acquires the knowledge. It's a visual omniscience from looking and seeing. Oh, so it's so funny. Like the whole Bible, it's pretty consolidated. It's pretty it's unified in their idea of how God acquires this knowledge and what kind of omniscience God has. It's not the Platonic, ungenerated knowledge from time eternal. So that's funny. It's funny. I love his proof text. They refute his ideas of how God knows what he knows.
Naked and open, nothing being hidden. You know, a lot of the clothes that they wear is largely about hiding. This is a good thing, by the way. There are clothes that are about not hiding. I think that's just, should be.
That probably deserves more than one person laughing in the audience. Maybe a slight chuckle of 2 or 3 more people.
In the bedroom of a married couple, and that's about it. But we are completely unhidden. There's nothing about me that's hidden. So God knows my secret thoughts. He can read my mind. He can read my mind. This you might be asking, like,
how does God read your mind? Because he tests to know. He puts you through trials. King David says, "Test my heart to know my heart. Put me through trials, see what I will do, and I will come out all the better for it. And that way you will know me." It's so funny. They don't put critical thought into their proof texts.
Satan read my mind too? Well, there's no scripture that I can think of that suggests that Satan can read the minds of men, although we do have scripture that says that Satan put it into the heart of Judah.
So look at his subtle transition. He goes to a verse about God testing a heart to know it, and then he jumps automatically to mind reading. I don't think he consciously understands what he's doing here, where he's going to an undefensible position, just assuming it's true because he found a slight proof text that might enforce his views. He really wants his views to be true, and these are his proof texts. And in his mind, these proof texts actually mean what he's claiming.
Judas to betray Jesus. So the idea is that he could sort of try to interject an idea or desire into someone's heart, but there's nothing specifically saying he can read the mind of a person. But I do think that Satan, after all these years, has probably become a pretty good study of human character. I mean, like me as a youth pastor, I've become fairly good at reading teenagers after all these years. And just reading people in general, we all tend to get better and better at that as we go on in life.
And so he's building a false contrast, but he hasn't established that God is a mind reader. None of his verses show that. And God knowing the hearts, how? The only mechanical way that he's presented so far about God knowing hearts and minds is through testing. And so in the same way that he knows the hearts and minds of these teenagers, that's the only proof text he's presented for how God knows the hearts and minds of these teenagers.
You can kind of read people. Well, I imagine he's fairly good at it, and but who knows? But we know for sure God definitely can read minds completely and entirely.
Oh, look at it! So God can completely and utterly read minds, and his proof texts are a couple of things about knowing the heart and mind, and then one that it describes how God knows it. Oh, it's not clicking. He doesn't get it.
And motives. So number 3. So first was that God knows what? Everything that happens in the universe. 2 is that God knows our secret thoughts and motives. 3 is...
like a spattering of proof texts from Job and Job's friends and Proverbs. Oh, it's funny.
Is that God knows the future. God knows the future.
And Proverbs are like general rules of thumb to begin with, and they can be contradictory, and they function like things your mom might tell you. And there's a whole scene in Hamlet, which is really funny because the father is giving this fatherly advice to Hamlet's buddy about how he should conduct himself. And it's like all like old wife's nonsense things. And the whole point of it is to just show that the father is a really ridiculous person. And that's what I think about when I think about Proverbs. You know, they might be good advices, and a string of them might be good advice, maybe. But generally, they're general rules of thumb. They don't always work out. And a proverb about you always being watched, so behave yourself. that sounds like a hyperbolic or a generalization to begin with. And then you got the additional problems of what is the eyes of the Lord? What are they? Is it God using eyes to visually see the world? Or are you going to discount? Matt Chandler would discount that. He'd say, "Oh no, God doesn't have eyes. God doesn't receive His knowledge through visual stimuli." And then is it God's angels? Is God's enforcers running around the world watching people like we see in Job, as we see in Revelation, as we see in Zechariah? Is that what's going on there? He's probably never been introduced to that concept, but. So it's funny. All his proof texts for his overarching grand things, they don't prove what he's trying to set out to prove. It's like you need better proof texts. You need to do contextual analysis. This is the problem with this systematic theology, this topical study, is that people start with their conclusion. They don't do it scientifically. They don't say, "Oh, let's look at what the evidence actually says, and that'll bring me to whatever conclusion." They start with their conclusion. And they just look for any verse that has anything similar to say, and they just pretend that reaches their ultimate conclusion. It doesn't work like that.
Psalm 139, verse 16, it says, "Your eyes saw my substance, being yet unformed. And in your book they were all written, the days fashioned for me, when as yet there were none of them." God's knowledge of the future. That was...
He hasn't dug in very deeply into that verse. So even John Calvin takes that verse and he says, this is not about God knowing everyone's days of their lives, knowing in perpetuity how long we'll live or anything like that. It's actually about fetology and the development of a baby in the womb. And that's what God knows, the days, the parts, when yet they were none, how the baby's going to develop in the womb. And so this is John Calvin's take on it. And John Calvin, I think John Calvin's actually a pretty decent scholar, a Greek scholar, a Hebrew scholar. He knows what he's talking about for the most part. You just have to read him with a grain of salt because he really wants his theology to be true. And so he forces it in some places. But when an advocate of total predestination, God knowing everything, when they're saying that this proof text that Matt Chandler is using is not a proof text for the view, we might want to listen, because those are the people with the most stake in the game to really, really want the proof text. And when they're saying it's not a proof text, maybe they're right.
Psalm 139, verse 16. Also, Isaiah chapter 41, verses 21 through 24. Isaiah 41, 21 through 24, it says, "Present your case, says the Lord. Bring forth your strong reasons, says the King of Jacob. Let them bring forth and show us what will happen." Now, here in Isaiah, God is challenging the false gods and the prophets of the
So here's some context. So this is good.
false gods. Oh, if you're true gods, if you really are who you say you are, then come and tell us the future. It seems that this knowledge of the future is exclusive to God.
Okay, so that was a little bit of a misrepresentation. So Isaiah 41, I believe he said. But in Isaiah, so here's what's going on. Israel is in exile. Isaiah 40 through about roughly 48 is a second Isaiah. It's written to Israel in exile. And there's this thing where Yahweh God is competing with the false gods for adherence. Israel has generally rejected him, and Yahweh's defeated, and they might as well go worship the gods of the Babylonians. And so the prophets of Yahweh come out and they say, no, this is not true. In fact, God predicted this exile. God said, this is going to be punishment for you to go into exile, and then it happened. And so we know God, Yahweh, is telling the truth, that this is God's power act, because God said it, and then God did it. And so that proves that he is the true God. He's a powerful God. It's a claim about power. And so the false gods, they might take credit for things after it happens. Oh, a volcano erupts. Oh, that was my God who did it. Well, if your God is only taking credit for things after they happen, that's not very convincing that was that God actually doing it. So the whole context of Isaiah is all about if someone has power to bring something about. It's not about knowledge. This is not like a survey, like let's figure out which God could predict the random dice roll. It was like a 20-sided dice. Let's see which God could predict the dice roll 100 rolls. It's not about that. It's not a trivia. hit the button, Jeopardy, figure out the right answer to what will happen in the future. This is about power. God says what he will do, and then he brings it about. And the false gods, they don't have any examples of that. So, which shows it's not about knowledge. It's not like, oh, Israel, you should worship God because he's a very knowledgeable guy. He knows all about the future, has a lot of information in that head. It's all about power. Israel, you should worship God because God says he will do something, and then he does it. He follows through. He has power. He has ability, and he is the true God. These other gods, it's not like, oh, these other gods, they just don't have the information in their head. It's not what's going on there. These other gods, they're powerless. They cannot act. They cannot say they're going to do something and then follow through and do it. You worship Yahweh because Yahweh is the true God. He is the powerful God. He's the one who says what he will do and then follows through. And in the context of Isaiah, he declares something new. And so when is God declaring these things? In the beginning, per Isaiah, God declares the beginning from the end in Isaiah. And the beginning is when he says he's going to do it. And he declares it to people so that they can write it down, record it, and spread it around that God's going to do this thing. And the end is after that thing happens. It's not about God declaring into a timeless eternity, oh, I'm going to do something at some date. No, it's about God declaring to his people what he's going to do and then following through. These are power claims. God is claiming, I am powerful. It's not a trivia knowledge contest. And this, not Matt Chandler, who is this guy? This is Mike Winger. Mike Winger, I should know that name. This Mike Winger, he's claiming that this is like a trivia contest, not what's going on in context.
It's exclusive to God. First Peter talks about how the things that were revealed to us are things that angels desired to look into. Like they were even waiting for the revelation of this gospel message.
And how is that relevant about complete omniscience?
That only God knew all that was going to happen and reveals pieces of it to us. So again,
so God can have plans, and God could carry through with those plans, and those plans can be flexible. Like God says, I'm going to destroy Nineveh in 40 days, and then he decides not to based on the actions of Nineveh. God declares that he's going to have an everlasting, eternal promise to Eli's house, and then he says, oh, no, because you guys are wicked, I'm going to revoke that eternal promise and replace it with a conditional promise. God promises to Abraham that he's going to have a complete lineage forever. He might destroy all of Abraham's lineage and go through Moses. Or he might destroy all of Abraham's lineage and rise new children of Abraham from the rocks. These are options that are available to God because God is powerful, and these are power claims, and God accomplishes his predictions, his prophecies through power rather than through knowledge. And this is a disconnect in this guy's mind. He really wants his omniscience to be true, and he really wants these to be proof texts. So he hasn't critically examined those proof texts to see if those proof texts really mean what he really wants those proof texts to mean.
Starting in verse 22 here, Isaiah 41. Let them bring forth and show us what will happen. Let them show the former things what they were, that we may consider them and know the latter end of them. Tell us what's going to happen next, is the idea. Or declare to us things to come. Show the things that are to come hereafter, that we may know that you are gods. Yes, do good or evil.
See, it's about doing. It's about doing. It's about accomplishing.
That we may be dismayed and see it together. Indeed, you are nothing, and your work is nothing.
And your work is nothing. This is about power. This is not a knowledge claim. This is not a trivia contest. It's about ability to perform.
He who chooses you is an abomination. The idea that false gods are exactly that. They're false. And one of the specific differences between false gods and true gods is this idea of prophecy. And there's only one true God, and there's only one source of prophecy, and that is God Almighty. That's why when we did our series on evidence for the Bible, I spent 10 weeks on prophecy. Because prophecy is something unique to Christianity, unique to the Bible. I could say unique to Judaism, but Christianity is the fulfillment of Judaism. So here we are standing grafted in, This is great, because this is God laying down the gavel. You want to test? Let's test. Let's do this prophecy thing. So God knows the future, and this, by the way, utterly...
I doubt that he did prophecy in a very systematic way, understanding prophecy. Prophecy is just statements from God about what God currently plans to do in the immediate context, in the immediate situation. And naturally, prophecy is meant to be averted. The purpose of the prophecy is to get the people to change and do other than what the people are doing, such that the prophecy doesn't come about. And that's the normal use and function of prophecy, is subverting the future, is that not happening. The prophecy is meant to not be fulfilled.
And completely refutes the idea of open theism, doesn't it? That God doesn't know what's going to happen next.
No, it doesn't. You're misreading your verses.
He knows. He knows all my days. He knows the things that are going to come next. He, in fact, challenged.
So this is what happens. They have this superficial reading of the Bible, and they just assume that all their texts. They've never gone out. He's doing a sermon on open theism. He's never gone out and read an open theist work on these proof texts of his. Open theists have answered this. They've answered it in basically any one of their works because these are common objections, and he has readily has access to all this information. But he's a superficial thinker, and so he just grabs his proof texts, and he gets this idea in his head of what open theism is, and so he fights a straw man that he built up in his own head without actually looking at the literature. He didn't do a genuine study of the issue.
Challenges others. He's the only one that knows it. So open theism, or the idea that you have a God that's limited. Now, what they do with this open theism thing is they think they're getting God off the hook for all the bad stuff that happens in the world. Right? Like, why is it that person got a disease, or that person died, or that person got murdered? And it's like, well, God didn't know. Okay, well, that...
Did anyone ever say that anywhere? Yeah, so pull up a source and please quote someone.
That's not biblical. That's the number one issue here, is that's just not biblical. I do have a whole video on YouTube. You guys are welcome to watch it, on the problem of evil. I didn't teach it here Sunday night. I taught it Sunday morning for the youth, but I did put it online, so it's available there if you're interested. If this is a problem that's plaguing your heart, just Google my name and the phrase "problem of evil," or "if God is good, why evil?" So there is that, but yeah, open theism is not where we need to go or can go if we're going to affirm what Scripture says. So number four, God knows the what ifs. This is an interesting idea of God's knowledge. God knows what if.
That's funny, because in your system there is no what if. There's God knows what the future will be no matter what. And so the what ifs are not actual what ifs. It's like God knowing nothings. Like you have a computer that is programmed to precisely do everything that it will do, and then you saying, well, I know what if this other contingency happens. That's not a thing to know, because that's not a thing that's in the realm of possibilities. Where do you have a God knowing the entire future and knowing how it will turn out? Everything's fated, and there is no what ifs. So any what ifs in the Bible that we come across is open theism. It's literally open theism. And what they do is they need to deal with them. So they turn it into this like cute little talking point, like, oh, God knows even the what ifs. There's no what ifs in your belief. This is incompatible with the system that you've set up in this fatalism, where everything that ever will happen is eternally known by God. There is no what ifs.
This is a really interesting concept. So let's read. Well, first off, you know what a what if, right, is, right? Like if Randy stands up and screams right now, how will Mike respond? Well, God knows. I don't actually know how to respond. I hope you don't do that. But his wife's like, please don't.
So note that. So yeah, all human beings are just input-output creatures in his view. That if you take a collection of stimuli and you input them into a creature, you could precisely predict the output that comes out of the creature. And so he's admitting to believing in fate, that human beings are just input-output creatures. That if you put precise stimuli into this complex machine known as man, you could precisely predict their response behavior. And so, fatalism in that system, it makes sense that fatalism is true, that God just controlled all the inputs from time eternal, and the fatalistic creature known as man received the right inputs that God eternally foreknown to output the exact outputs that God eternally foreknew. And he's admitting to it. He's admitting to it without realizing he's admitting to fatalism. Man is just a machine. Man is just an input-output robot.
But God knows what I would do under any set of circumstances. He knows what you would do under any set of
input-output
circumstances. He knows that if this creature dies right here today, how that will change the fertility of the soil for plants growing later on, which will affect when someone's walking through the field sometime 100 years later. Like, the Lord knows every detail and every ramification of things.
Okay, so let's get to your proof text, dude.
So this is supported in Scripture. Matthew 11:21. Jesus speaking in Matthew 11:21 says, "Woe to you, Chorazin."
Okay, so was Jesus omniscient? Because Jesus admitted to not knowing when the end times would be, when the Father's return will be. So not even the Son knows that. And so they do this thing where they'll quote these ideas from Jesus talking, and they'll say, see, omniscience in Jesus. But Jesus wasn't omniscient. And so that undermines, that tells you actually that a non-omniscient person, Jesus, can know these things. It undermines omniscience rather than reinforces it.
Woe to you, Bethsaida, for if the mighty works which were done in you had been done in Tyre and Sidon, they would have repented long ago in sackcloth and ashes.
Again, look at how they're treating the Bible. They treat the Bible as it's not a document that's recording normal human conversation with other human beings. Jesus is insulting these people. Jesus is saying, you are worse than Tyre and Sidon. You are worse than Sodom and Gomorrah, he says. You are so bad. And it's an insult. And it's not like, you don't have to take that like seriously. And like it's a metaphysical certainty that these inputs would have resulted in those outputs. It's an insult. Oh, it's funny. And so he takes an insult, a jab at these people, calling them worse than these other villages. That's what it's actually doing. It's idiomatic speech saying you are worse than these really awful people. And that's the point Jesus is trying to get across. And so he takes that and he says, oh, what this is it's metaphysics. Jesus knows the input-outputs of Tyre, Sidon. He knows the input-outputs of Sodom and Gomorrah. He knows all these input-outputs, and he can predict, based on these metaphysical inputs and outputs, the reactions. It's not what's going on in the text, my friend.
Let me repeat the important part. For if, the what if, the mighty works which...
Yeah, pretend I'm doing this, and Jesus says, I am the door. And so I get up there and say, Jesus is the door. He says he's the door. He's made out of wood, and we could open Jesus, and we could walk through Jesus, and then we could close it, and then there's a lock in the door because Jesus says he's a door. I'll read it again. Jesus says, I am the door. You know, this is the level of analysis this guy's giving to these proof texts of his.
The what if. The mighty works which were done in you, as Jesus performed miracles, did things in those cities, if they had been done in Tyre and Sidon, they would have repented long ago in sackcloth and ashes. So if Jesus had come earlier to a different group of cities, that city would have repented. Boy, that's interesting, isn't it? You might be like, well, why didn't he come? Well, if he had to pick a time to come. If he came then, he might be saying to Tyre and Sidon, hey, if I'd come at this other time, this other thing would have happened. But the Lord knows the what ifs, all of the what ifs. Ezekiel 3, verses 4 through 6, another one of these what if things. It says, then he said to me, Son of man, God speaking to Ezekiel, go to the house of Israel and speak my words to them, for you were not sent to a people of unfamiliar speech or of hard language, but to the house of Israel. So he's not going to Gentiles, he's going to Israel. But then this is interesting. Look at what he says. Not, verse 6, not to many people of unfamiliar speech and of hard language, whose words you cannot understand. Surely, had I sent you to them, they would have listened to you.
Again, this is insulting language. This is saying you guys are so stubborn that you are worse than these other people. And is it hyperbolic? Is this supposed to be like this? Literally, these inputs would have resulted in these outputs. And even if it was that, how predictable is that? You could produce aggregate actions of individuals on a mass scale. And we see that in prediction markets all the time. It's not hard to do, but this phrase here, even if it, let's pretend it is a mass movement, I don't know. It doesn't sound like it to me. It sounds like an insult, and a very effective insult against some people, saying you are worse than Gentiles. You are supposed to be God's people, and you're worse than Gentiles, is what's going on there.
That's interesting, isn't it? If Ezekiel, the same prophet, had been sent to...
And again, this is nothing he's presenting right now is talking about omniscience, God knowing all things. He's talking about God knowing counterfactuals, which a lot of open theists don't disagree that God knows counterfactuals, like Boyd's a neo-Molinist, that God knows all possible futures and all different combinations of futures. At least in that allows for like maybe free will, because God knows that if I say yes or no to a question without knowing which one I'll actually say to the question, at least Boyd's understanding of neo-Molinism is consistent with actual free will. Whereas this guy thinks that humans are input-output robots. You just input the right things, and then you can predict with precise precision those outputs, which I don't think it works like that. You could produce movements in mass, but at an individual level, it gets very tricky.
To a different group of people, they would have listened to him. He was sent to Israel, and here they are, largely not listening. That's really interesting. So God knows the what-ifs and seems to be making choices about how he'll handle reality, and he factors in all of these what-ifs.
Yeah, I don't think he's treating the Bible like a historical document of conversations with different individuals with polemical and metaphorical and idiomatic language. He's treating it as a car manual that you just open and you just assume your meaning onto the text. That's what he does a lot. And his proof texts don't prove what he's trying to prove. He's trying to prove God knows all counterfactuals ever, and he points to God knowing maybe one counterfactual. It doesn't prove what you're trying to prove, dude. It doesn't do it. It doesn't say God knows in all situations what everyone will do given the correct inputs. He's going from a very specific case to a generalization. And you would think, because of the focus on omniscience in all these people, the Matt Chandlers of the world, the Mike Wingers of the world, all these guys, the Spurgeons of the world, they care about it a lot. They have entire sermons on omniscience. The Bible doesn't have any of that. And if the Bible authors actually believed in this type of omniscience, and you would expect something. You'd expect them to say, oh, God knows all counterfactuals somewhere. But no. That's just a topic that these guys care about, that the Bible doesn't actually care about or advocate. And they are desperate for proof texts, so they have to go grab specific examples of possible counterfactuals known by God and just apply it generally. You can't go from details to generalizations like that. That's not how these things work.
These are kind of important, and actually, right now, in the world of theology, in the world.
So how that works, though, is if someone makes a overarching claim that covers everything, God knows all things, that could be disproved by God not knowing one thing, right? That's how that works. So a universal can be disproved by positive evidence of one counterpoint. And but you can't make a universal claim off of the data of just one data point. You can't go from details to generalities. You can't say, oh, because my car is red, I don't have a red car. My car is red, and so all cars are red. That's invalid. But you can go from someone saying all cars are red to me saying, my car is gray over here, so not all cars are red. And then that the details, the specific counter example disproves the generalization. And let's pretend we live in a Model T world where Ford, when he made the Model T, all his cars were black. And so someone might claim, oh, all cars are black. And some other guy, he might have grabbed some red paint and he painted his Model T red or something like that. And he might have a counterexample and say, hey, but I got a red car. Another guy might say, this was a generalization. Yeah, pretty much all cars are black. And so it's not incorrect of me to say all cars are black, even though you might have a specific counterexample. So generalizations can work in the face of counterexamples, whereas metaphysical absolutes, all-encompassing statements, do not work. It shuts it down. And he doesn't deal with this counter evidence against his position, does he? I mean, we're only like 20 minutes in, and I guess that's pretty painful because this podcast is like over an hour so far or something like that. Oh, I don't know if we're going to get to it. We're going to get to it if he actually addresses this. Well, I'll listen to it. We'll see if he addresses counterpoints against his arguments. But he seems very unfamiliar with the literature. He seems to do a lot of his assumptions about his proof texts. Well, let's hear what he says.
World of people who are studying these sorts of things. This is actually, believe it or not, a really pivotal issue. And there's a fancy word for it. Okay, so I'm going to teach you guys the fancy philosophical term for God knowing the what ifs. It's called middle knowledge. Middle knowledge. This is, I don't know, that middle knowledge is probably the easiest thing to remember. It's why it's correlated with the idea of what ifs. I could get into that some other time. But it's an interesting concept. It's the idea that God knows if he had created the world slightly differently, exactly how things would have gone. Let's suppose that Winston Churchill was never born. Let's suppose that that Thomas Edison had never existed. Let's suppose that Martin Luther died in the thunderstorm he was caught in before he really became converted. God knows all those what ifs. He knows exactly what would happen, and he's chosen to allow things to happen, in many cases, cause specifically things to happen.
And notice that this is the fatalistic view, that human creatures are input-output robots. All you have to do to get a specific output is put specific inputs into that human, and then they'll just act according to those inputs. It's a fatalistic view. And the Molinists say, no, look, there are options. There are different things that could happen in different circumstances. You don't get past fatalism. Fatalism is the idea that we don't have free will to choose different options. You think that our choices are just the summation of the inputs that we've experienced up to that time. And Molinism, we've talked about Molinism in quite a few podcasts. We've talked about how it's an irrational view to hold. It doesn't get you past the problem of fatalism. And if you're incorporating an eternal, ungenerated knowledge in God, that means necessarily that all events don't have counterfactuals. All events are necessary events. There is no way that there's possibilities or probabilities in events where they can have a counterfactual become true. It's just not possible in that world in which God eternally knows the truth value of all propositions. All propositions have an eternal truth value. Can't be any different. But they do this shifting cards thing. They do this sleight of hand where they say, "Oh, look at there's these situations that we're human beings and we understand that if someone wiggles their hand, that wiggling might have been in a different way," and then they'll just attribute that to their system and say, see, there could be counterfactuals because we can visualize them in our head without addressing the internal functioning of their system, how their system disallows counterfactuals from ever coming true, ever being a possibility. It's not a possibility. 100% things will happen that God foreknows. Those things are fated, destined, necessary events, no possibility of not happening, just in the system they set up. But we're going to have to break off there. I'll listen to the rest of this guy and see if we want to do a part two. There's a lot of part twos I need to do about a lot of people, but it's fun. It takes a lot of time, but Mike Winger, he's the charismatic guy. I understand why people are listening to him. He's easy to listen to. He seems like a nice guy, but he doesn't seem to have the depth. He doesn't critically analyze his proof text. He doesn't do it. All right, thank you for listening. Start comment in the YouTube section or start a thread on Facebook, and we'll talk. It'll be good.